Welcome to the lecture on cost-benefit analysis. In today's lecture, I will present a reflection on cost-benefit analysis. My name is Behnam Taebi, and I'm with the group of philosophy at Delft University. Today's lectures have two sections. In section 1, or part 1, I will discuss the methods of ethics, and I will discuss how a cost-benefit analysis is rooted in ethical thinking. In part 2, I will elaborate on several challenges from a philosophical point of view to a cost-benefit analysis. Let me start with part 1, or the methods of ethics. I would like to call this the basic math in ethical reasoning, because as with the basic math for a good engineer, you also need the basic math in your ethical reasonings to be able to reason in a proper manner. Let me start with a thought experiment. What you see here is the cable car in San Francisco. So the thought experiment is happening in a country with hills, like this cable car in San Francisco. Before I present you the thought experiments, I would like to ask you that you are required to answer the question very quickly. The thought experiment is the following. A cable car is coming down the hills of San Francisco. 5 workers are working on the rail, and the cable car cannot brake. The brakes do not work. If nothing happens, the cable car could go towards the 5 workers that cannot hear it coming, and it will kill 5 workers. However, you, the red person in the picture, are able to divert the car to 1 worker who's working on a sideline. The question would be, would you divert the cable car? I suspect that the majority of you would do so, arguing that killing 1 or 1 death would be better than 5 deaths, because 4 in total would be what you save. So going back to the ethical reasoning and the basic math in ethics, there are 3 methods of ethical reasoning. One will be consequentialism, or more specifically utilitarianism, as I will discuss today. It goes back to Jeremy Bentham. The second method will be deontology and duty-based ethics. That goes back to the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And the third ethical school that I will discuss today would be virtue ethics, that discusses the virtues and characters, and it dates back to ancient Greek. Let me start with consequentialism. A consequentialist argues that an action is morally right whenever it creates net positive consequences. Consequentialism would then require you to first tally the good and the bad consequences of an action, and then compare those good and bad consequences. If the good outweigh the bad, the action is a morally right action. Utilitarianism is a specific type of consequentialism. A utilitarian argues that an action is morally right if the consequences of that action would increase the overall utility. Utility could also be expressed in terms of well-being or happiness. A specific type of utilitarians would argue that utility could also be expressed in monetary value or money. That is how a cost-benefit analysis is made. A cost-benefit analysis is then grounded in utilitarianism as an ethical way of reasoning. Recall, when I showed to you the example of the trolley in the hills of San Francisco, you probably showed or argued that it is better to divert the trolley towards 1 rather than 5. That would be a consequentialist way of reasoning. Here is a counterexample, another thought experiment. And this experiment is actually especially for those of you who first argued that we should divert the trolley. This is an example that showed why utilitarianism or consequentialism would sometimes fail. Second thought experiment is the following. The same 5 workers are working on the rails. The trolley is coming down the hill very fast and it cannot brake. There is no sidetrack this time. There is a very big fat man on a bridge whom you could give a push, who will then end up in front of the trolley. In my thought experiment, it will stop the trolley. Would you do so? You would notice that there is an unease in this example. Even for those people who decided to divert the train or the trolley towards 1, would have difficulties pushing the fat man. This is the example that has been shown to argue that consequentialism is not necessarily the right way of arguing. Deontologists are a group of scholars who argue that morality should be discussed in terms of its foundational principle of duty. duties that we owe to each other and to ourselves. Immanuel Kant, the founding father of this school of thinking, argues that there is a self-evident principle of reason that he calls the categorical imperative. Categorical meaning that it is not hypothetical, it will apply all the time in all situations. An imperative is a rule. So Kant would argue, act according to the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it will become a universal law. This is also referred to as the golden rule. The third school of thinking that I will discuss in less details would be virtue ethics. The driving force of ethical behavior in virtue ethics would be the moral agent, or the individual human being who's involved in decision making. This is one of the oldest normative traditions that goes back to Plato and Aristotle, and it argues that, for instance, natural feeling of fear would help us to develop the virtue of courage. There are certain virtues that, the four cardinal virtues that Plato himself discusses, the wisdom, prudence, temperance, and justice. Let's move on to the second section of this talk. I'm going to discuss several philosophical problems of a cost-benefit analysis here. As you remember, I argued that cost-benefit analysis is rooted in the philosophical thinking of utilitarianism. There are several challenges to a cost-benefit analysis. The first one would be the topic selection. For very obvious reasons of resource limitations, we cannot make a cost-benefit analysis for every single decision that we make. We have to narrow down the focus. And a cost-benefit analysis is much more common in the public sector than in the private sector. So business decisions with pollutions are not necessarily subjected to a cost-benefit analysis, while regulatory decisions reducing the same pollution would be subjected to a cost-benefit analysis. The question would be, is it justified that public funding will be spent to reduce that pollution? One ensuing question would be, how can we include important social and environmental effects in such a cost-benefit analysis? The second issue would be choosing perspective. Because, take for instance the CO2 reduction, if you now choose the local, regional, or national perspective, different conclusions would follow. Because a measure could be good from a local perspective and less good from a national perspective. A cost-benefit analysis is also sometimes used to assess whether the cost and benefit of a certain regulation, or a change in design for that matter, would be justified. A good example would be the example of Ford Pinto that I'm going to show to you on the next slide. The judge advised in the United States the jury that Ford should be convicted of reckless homicide. Ford's defense would be based on an interesting cost-benefit analysis because they argued that technological improvement of the design was not cost-effective, even though they did know about the technical malfunction. What was the problem? This is the Ford Pinto. And what happened in the design of the Ford Pinto, that the fuel tank was situated in a place that in a rear-end accident, the fuel tank could be ruptured. A ruptured fuel tank in a two-doors car is very dangerous because especially the passengers who are sitting in the back of the car will be burned to death. Ford argued in the court that they did know about this, but they decided not to change the design following this cost-benefit analysis that you see. I'm not going to discuss the details of the cost-benefit analysis. This you could read in the book. But what is interesting here is to see is that Ford is using different perspectives because the benefit that they are presenting are the benefits from the company perspective, while the costs are the costs for the benefits are from the societal perspective, while the costs are the company costs. So choosing different perspectives has led to a conclusion that is not very valid. The third issue would be the issue of prediction. Social and technical predictions are very difficult, and it will hamper forecast-oriented technological assessments. In particular, when it comes to the cost-benefit analysis, it becomes very problematic because the consequences far off the action, both spatial consequences and temporal consequences, would depend on very complex causal mechanisms. Especially when there are indirect consequences, it becomes even more problematic to assess those consequences and to be able to draw any kind of conclusion. The fourth issue would be the issue of moral exclusion. Should we include positive consequences of something that might be called immoral acts? As I said, a consequentialist would focus on the consequences to assess the morality or the rightness of an action. But Even not using consequentialism, we might be able to refer to something as a moral or immoral acts. The question would be, how do we assess the morality of an action? For instance, using the ontology or the duty-based ethics. Let me give you an example. A recent example that was going on in the Dutch political debates previous years. The speed limits has been increased from 120 to 130 on the Dutch highways. So we do know that there is one important argument when increasing speed limits is actually the time gain and road construction, the time gain in road construction projects. So when we speed up, we are able to arrive earlier at work, which is an economic profit or benefit. So the time gain from exceeding speed limits is calculated in the cost-benefit analysis. But the question would be, how could we include or take into account the fact that speeding would lead to the number of deaths of innocent victims? Could we actually quantify that one way or the other? And is it morally legitimate that we take that into account in such a cost-benefit analysis? The fifth issue will be the issue of distribution. Cost-benefit analysis, but also consequentialism in general, as the ethical theory in which cost-benefit analysis is grounded, is egalitarian. Egalitarian meaning that everybody is the same. Jeremy Bentham, the founding father of consequentialism, argues that everybody counts for one and no one for more than one. This is a dictum that is very important and influential in contemporary thinking on democracy. While this is intuitively very compelling, some people are more equal, in the sense that the people that are living next to the roads or exposed to the risk might deserve additional considerations. So we cannot simply argue that in technological developments, all people should be treated equally, because some people are imposed to additional risk. So a cost-benefit analysis and consequentialism would deny such distributional effects. Some scholars argued that we need to actually add a distribution test to a conventional cost-benefit analysis. The sixth problem is the problem of valuation. It has two parts. The first issue would be the issue of incommensurability. Two things are incommensurable when we cannot necessarily compare them in terms of the same units. Incommensurable does not necessarily mean uncomparable, but it is not comparable in the same unit. For instance, how could we assign economic values to what we find invaluable? Human life, animal species, or the environment? So even if we remove money from this issue, so it's not necessarily about assigning money, even if when we remove money from the analysis, the question would be, how could we compare different entities? How many fatalities would equal one, how many severe injuries would equal one death? Is the same issue as we discussed earlier, and this also relates to incommensurability. It is also important to be able to assign monetary value, and it could affect very much the conclusions in a cost-benefit analysis. Let's have a look at the same cost-benefit analysis that Ford presented in 1971. Ford argued that the life of an individual human being would equal about $200,000. And this is the economic calculations they presented for supporting that conclusion. The table you could read in the book. European Union calculated in the year 2000 that a measure that will spare one life, 8 serious injuries, 26 light injuries, and 200 material damage could spare €1 million as benefits. Those benefits will be medical cost, material cost, less productivity, etc. So when making those cost-benefit analyses, €1 million should equal the numbers that you just saw. The second issue relating to the valuation problem is the issue of discounting. How do we calculate costs and benefits over time? Discounting is very undisputed and desirable even for short-term decision-making because the value of money declines over time. But it is very controversial when it comes to long-term planning issues. There is a serious contention going on about, for instance, what would be an appropriate discount rate when it comes to the climate change discussions. The following example very well supports or shows this contention. A group of scholars led by Nicholas Stern have presented a report in which they argue that 1.4% would be the appropriate discount rate when it comes to climate change discussions and appropriate measures. Stern and his colleagues argue that the only acceptable and defensible course of action would be mitigation or the reduction of CO2. However, another group of scholars, led by William Nordhaus, have presented 6% as a discount rate. They say that mitigation is way too expensive. The proposed course of action by Nordhaus would be adaptation. So we see that only changing the figure from 1.4 to 6 would drastically affect our conclusions. Stern himself and in his group, the ethical arguments are given a place, while William Nordhaus will follow more what is called a positivist way of reasoning, so more based on economic calculations. In conclusion, today's talk had two sections. In the first section, I've presented three important ethical theories to you, and I've argued that a cost-benefit analysis is rooted in consequentialism, and more specifically in utilitarianism. In the second section, a cost-benefit analysis is presented as the most influential methods in policymaking, after which I have discussed several challenges to this cost-benefit analysis. What I have argued today is not that we should dismiss a cost-benefit analysis. This is one of the most important methods in policymaking. What I argue is that we should be aware of the shortcomings of a cost-benefit analysis, and we should try to adjust it accordingly as much as possible. Thank you for your attention.